Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nathaniel Clement. In this lesson, we will be going through Unit 1, Aerobic and Anaerobic Respiration. By the end of today's presentation, you should be able to tell me what is respiration? Why do we need to respire? What are electron carriers? What is aerobic respiration? What are the steps of aerobic respiration? What is anaerobic respiration? And what are the types of anaerobic respiration? Before we delve deeper in this lesson, let me clarify what I mean by respiration. When someone is asked, what is respiration? A typical response would be that respiration is the process by which you inhale oxygen and you exhale carbon dioxide. While generally this is true, in specific circumstances, like in aerobic and anaerobic respiration study, this is not what respiration is. This process is known as ventilation. Respiration is the process by which a biological molecule, such as glucose, is used to produce energy that the body can use. For most examples in this lesson, we'll be sticking to using glucose as our main source of energy. And the energy that the body tends to utilize is typically found in the form of adenosine triphosphate. Don't let the word scare you. We can call it ATP for short. There are two main types of respiration that we'll be covering in this lesson: aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. At this point, you might be asking yourself, why do I need to respire? Or why does a living thing have to respire? The short answer is because otherwise you would die. The long answer is that all organisms need energy to live. To get that energy, they take complex biological molecules and break them down in respiration. These complex biological molecules can either be made or they can be collected from other organisms or from the environment. Respiration allows organisms to take complex biological molecules, typically from digestion or photosynthesis, and convert them into energy that the body can use in the form of ATP. When talking about respiration, these two words come up together a lot as they play an important role in respiration. Electron carriers are small organic molecules that are typically derived from vitamin B's that act as an electron transport system. They help transfer electrons and other ions from one place or one molecule to another. In organic chemistry and in biology, the movement of electrons and other ions help drive many important biological processes such as respiration. In this case, electron carriers transfer electrons via oxidation or reduction reactions. Now that hopefully you have a better grasp on what an electron carrier is, let's discuss what aerobic respiration is. Aerobic respiration is the process by which oxygen is used to turn fuel, such as fats or sugars or other biological molecules, into chemical energy in the form of ATP. Basically, aerobic respiration is respiration that utilizes oxygen. Typically, this form of respiration produces a lot more energy than the other form, anaerobic respiration. But its biggest drawback is that for aerobic respiration to work, it can only function in the presence of oxygen. You might be asking yourself, why is that? Well, you might find the answer near the end of this lesson. But in short, aerobic respiration just won't work without oxygen. Many organisms, such as the amoeba on screen, utilize aerobic respiration. It's useful because it produces a lot of energy in a short amount of time, which is important for complex and especially multicellular organisms because they require a lot of energy in a short amount of time. That's why the vast majority of living things are anaerobic, even though it would be better if they weren't so heavily reliant on oxygen. To better your understanding and to make things simple, here is an equation for the overall reaction. For those high school and college students, you may be familiar with this formula, where glucose here reacts with oxygen to form carbon dioxide and water and energy, in this case ATP. In this reaction, you need to take in oxygen from ventilation and glucose from digestion, and then release it in the form of carbon dioxide, through which you remove from your body through ventilation again. And you can store the water in your body. But what we're really after is the energy. That's what drives your body. And that is what respiration is for. Now that we have a better understanding of the overall process, let's dig into the individual steps and parts of aerobic respiration. It's a lot to take in at once, so it'll be a good idea to do your own research and reading to help you understand. The first step in aerobic respiration is called glycolysis. Glycolysis is the process by which glucose, which is a 6 carbon molecule, gets converted and broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvate, which is a 3 carbon molecule. This prepares it for the next steps in aerobic respiration. This process typically occurs in the cell cytoplasm. It consumes 2 molecules of ATP, but generates 4 of them, giving us a net gain of ATP of 2 molecules of ATP. This process also generates 2 molecules of NADH, one of the electron carriers that I mentioned, which will be important later, so we'll get back to it. The next step in aerobic respiration is called the link reaction. This reaction can also be known as the transition reaction or oxidative decarboxylation. Don't let the big word scare you. Think Link reaction. It's a reaction that links the first step to the next step. Here, one molecule of pyruvate is combined with a coenzyme A. This process produces something called acetylcholine. Not to get into nitty-gritty, it's important for the next step. But this process also causes carbon dioxide to be released, which we'll get back to later. This process occurs in the mitochondrial matrix, which is the outermost membrane of the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. This process also produces one more molecule of NADH, which means that for one glucose molecule, since we get two pyruvates, in this part of the reaction, you get two NADH molecules. The next step is known as the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle can also be called the citric acid cycle or the triboxylic acid cycle, but basically, it's a series of chemical reactions that the acetylcholine goes under. It's a cycle because at the end, the final product of the reaction gets converted back into acetylcholine, which gets fed back into the reaction series. This is important because it generates a lot of electron carriers, like FAD2H2, NADH, and ATP. Specifically, for every one round, one molecule of FADH2 is produced, one molecule of ATP is produced, and three molecules of NADH is produced. You can do the multiplication for one glucose molecule will equal 2 cycles, which will double everything. The final step in this reaction is called the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain are a series of protein complexes, or proteins, that are embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane. That's the second membrane that the mitochondria has inside of it. This is special to the mitochondria, because it's one of the few organelles that have two membranes. They're used to pump out hydrogen ions out of the mitochondria. These protein pumps are powered by the electron carriers, which give them their electrons to help them pump the hydrogen ions out of the mitochondria. Now, why is this important? What this process does is create a chemical gradient. Everyone here should know what osmosis is. Osmosis is when a solution moves from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration through a semi-permeable membrane. In this case, the semi-permeable membrane is the mitochondrial matrix. Those hydrogen ions want back in after getting pumped out, but they can't because they can't fit through. This is important. This creates a chemical potential energy, which then is used to drive a special enzyme called ATP synthase. If the name didn't give it away, this enzyme is responsible for creating ATP. This whole setup works something like a water wheel, where a special protein channel acts as a gate to let those hydrogen ions back into the mitochondria. They pass by the ATP synthase and cause it to generate ATP in a process known as oxidative phosphorylation. This produces a lot of ATP, more than any other step, and is where you get the vast majority of ATP. At any given time, it produces between 30 to 36 molecules of ATP. This is the entire process of aerobic respiration. This is a diagram of the entire process. Glycolysis, the link reaction, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. All these processes work together to create the ATP that your body needs, or any organism needs, to stay alive and healthy. In glycolysis, you can see it happens in two steps, where the glucose is first converted into fructose 6-phosphate, which then gets broken and converted into pyruvate. Note how a 6-carbon molecule, glucose, gets converted into a 3-carbon molecule, pyruvate. And note where in the first step, you lose 2 ATP. In the last step of glycolysis, you gain 4 more ATP. Here is the link reaction, where pyruvate gets converted into acetylcholine when it's bonded to coenzyme A. Here, when it enters the Krebs cycle, it goes through these various organic compounds, which you don't need to learn to in depth in most cases, but it wouldn't hurt to do some extra reading on the process. What's important is that to notice is that it generates lots of electron carriers, which is important in the final step when we go to the electron transport chain. Each of these electron carriers donates an electron to the protein matrices in the electron transport chain, which helps them pump hydrogen ions out. Then, when enough of them gets pumped out, the concentration is high enough, they're let back in through this protein beads, the ATP synthase, which causes the ATP synthase to generate ATP. As a side effect of all this, you get a bunch of hydrogen molecules and electrons inside the mitochondria. Now, if all this was to build up, this whole process would stop because no new electron carriers will be able to donate any more electrons because there's already too many. How is this all addressed? You'll find out later in the presentation. Now that we hopefully understand what aerobic respiration is, let's look at the other type of respiration in this lesson, anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is the process by which the same glucose is broken down to create energy in the form of ATP, and here's the key, without oxygen. This is important because this means that you can have generation of energy without oxygen, which is very useful in cases where there isn't much oxygen around. Like if you're in a low oxygen environment, or if you burn through a lot of oxygen in a short amount of time, and it's taking time for you to recover it. The biggest drawback of anaerobic respiration is that it's less efficient than aerobic respiration because it produces a lot less ATP overall. Now, there are two main types of anaerobic respiration that you need to be aware of at this level. These are lactic acid fermentation and ethanol or alcoholic respiration, fermentation. These two processes allow organisms to create energy without oxygen. Now that you know what anaerobic respiration is, let's talk about lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation is a form of respiration where without oxygen, sugars like glucose are broken down to produce ATP. This process is called lactic acid fermentation because, if you can guess, one of the byproducts of this reaction is lactic acid, or lactate. In this diagram here, we can see that the process has two distinct steps. The first step is pretty much identical to glycolysis, where glucose gets broken down into pyruvate. Cool. Then we undergo a fermentation reaction, which converts the pyruvate into lactate, or lactic acid. This is done to help recoup the electron carriers and to restart the cycle so they can produce more ATP. As you can see, the only ATP generating step here is the glycolysis reaction, which is why this reaction overall is so inefficient. Here are the basic equations for both steps in the reaction and an overall simplification. That should make it easier for you to follow what's going on. The key thing to note is that the electron carriers are being reset so they can prepare to start the next round of glycolysis. Now that we have a better understanding of what lactic acid fermentation is, let's look at the other type of anaerobic respiration, ethanol fermentation. Ethanol fermentation, like lactic acid fermentation, is respiration without oxygen. This type of respiration generally occurs in organisms like fungi or yeast, whereas previously that lactic acid fermentation is reserved more or less for certain types of bacteria like lactobacillus. Specifically, yeast only undergo this type of fermentation or respiration when exposed to a low oxygen environment, as they generally prefer the aerobic pathway or prefer to use aerobic respiration. If you look at the diagram here, we start out with the same glycolysis reaction. Glucose is converted to 2 molecules of pyruvate and generates 2 molecules of ATP. But unlike lactic acid fermentation, the pyruvate then gets converted into aldehyde, another type of organic compound, which then gets further converted to ethanol. During the pyruvate aldehyde conversion, 2 molecules of carbon dioxide are lost, which is where the carbon dioxide in this reaction comes from. Here are basically the simplified chemical reactions of all 3 steps of this alcohol fermentation process. A thing of note is that the ethanol is toxic to yeast, which is why they don't like using this pathway. This could cause a deadly buildup of ethanol if it is used too much. It's a similar situation with lactic acid fermentation, where it can cause a buildup of lactic acid. Which, by the way, is why when you exercise, your muscles burn. When you exercise, your muscles don't get oxygen, creating a low oxygen environment, where your body switches from aerobic to anaerobic respiration. This process produces a lot of lactic acid, which gets temporarily stored in the muscles and causes that burning sensation. That's why you need to take a break. It allows your body time to clear the lactic acid from your system and allows you to get back to normal health and to hopefully resume physical activity later. Now that we have a better understanding of what respiration is, what electron carriers are, what aerobic and anaerobic respiration are, how anaerobic respiration takes place, the types of aerobic and anaerobic processes that take place in your body and in other organisms, time for some fun facts to help you remember all this. First fun fact. Remember what I was hinting at earlier? How in the electron transfer chain that we have a buildup of hydrogen ions and electrons that we need to get rid of in order to restart the system? Otherwise, it would get backed up with electron carriers, which would prevent the system from working. That's where the oxygen comes in. When you breathe in oxygen, your cells take it in. When the oxygen enters the mitochondria now, it accepts the stray electrons and hydrogen ions to form H2O, water. which can then be safely stored or excreted from the body, freeing up the electron transfer chain, allowing it to start over anew. But since now we know why we need to take oxygen in, why does our body keep producing carbon dioxide? Where does it come from? Well, the second fun fact is the carbon dioxide that we exhale comes from the Krebs cycle. It's true. Remember when I showed you earlier on in the Krebs cycle that carbon dioxide was being produced as part of the cycle? That's where the carbon dioxide you exhale comes from. And that's one of the reasons why you need to breathe it out. It helps clear out the carbon dioxide and prevent the concentration from getting too high in the cells, which can slow down the Krebs cycle, which would hinder respiration. These facts are tied to aerobic respiration. So let's look at some fun facts about anaerobic respiration. Remember what I mentioned earlier that during lactic acid fermentation, the lactic acid is produced? Well, the fact is that this reaction can be harnessed to create foods like yogurt, cheese, pickled foods such as kimchi or sauerkraut, soy sauce, and sourdough bread. The lactic acid it produced gives these foods their tangy or sour taste, and also acts as a natural preservative. Remember when I said that lactic acid can cause your muscles to burn? Well, it's inherently toxic to some microorganisms in large quantities, like the quantities you find during the production of these foods. But it's not so much that it can be harmful to humans. Just enough to give you that tangy or sour flavor you like in your favorite from some of your favorite fermented foods like cheese or yogurt. But if you're wondering where you get foods like wine, brandy, champagne, whiskey, or rum from, that's where the second fun fact comes in. These foods, in addition to bread, are made using ethanol fermentation or alcohol fermentation. This process in distilleries, especially the modified yeast strains, which are resistant to ethanol, are used to break down sugars like lactose, fructose, glucose, and things like grapes, potatoes, grain, etc., to reduce ethanol and carbon dioxide. In most cases, in the production of these foods, the carbon dioxide is expelled, while in some cases, like in champagne, the carbon dioxide is stored. In the case of bread, we need this reaction to allow the bread to rise, as the carbon dioxide produced by this reaction helps form bubbles in the dough, in addition to things like baking soda or sodium bicarbonate. This creates air pockets in the dough, which cause the breads to rise, give it its flaky, spongy interior that we all love. Hopefully, now that we near the end of this lesson, you've learned a lot. By now, hopefully you've learned what respiration is and what anaerobic and aerobic respiration is. Hopefully, you've learned about the different types of anaerobic respiration and the pathway that the body goes through every day to do aerobic and respiration. It's amazing that these processes occur in the body naturally and all around you and are a part of your everyday life. That's one of the best things about science. It's everywhere. One of the best ways to protect science and yourself is to ensure that whenever you do research, that is from a reputable source and that you do detailed research, as well as cite or reference any information you find to make sure everyone gets their due credit. It's also important to do research on your own, which helps better your understanding. It's a good idea to do your own independent research on all these topics so you can learn more because there's only so much you can cover in 30 minutes in just 16 slides. Hopefully you found this lesson entertaining and informative. This has been another amazing presentation by e-Biome. This has been a presentation on Unit 1, Aerobic and Anaerobic Respiration. And on behalf of the e-Biome crew, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope you've learned so much. This is Nathaniel Clements. Thank you so much for watching.